Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all doing well, and I want to thank you for joining us for this webinar on climate change and migration in the church. Hopefully, it'll be an interesting opportunity for everyone to learn a little bit. 1 second. Okay. So I want to start off with a quote, and that quote is from St. Pope Paul VI, from his Octodecimo Adveniens, which was published 50 years ago in May of 1971. And here he wrote that man is suddenly becoming aware that by an ill-considered exploitation of nature, he risks destroying it and becoming in turn the victim of this degradation. Our actions have resulted in a situation via environmental exploitation, abuse, that has put us into a position of peril. And it does this in a number of different ways. First of all, there are melting ice caps and rising sea levels, which can inundate local low-lying coastal regions. There are droughts and excessive rain, which can undercut agriculture and destroy the ability of peoples to feed themselves and infect their families. Deforestation risks sort of destroying animal habitats and leading to all sorts of unforeseen consequences as a consequence of that. It also risks inducing migration that would not otherwise be intended under normal circumstances. This is really the purpose of this webinar today, is to look at sort of the issue of climate change on the one hand, but then also look at how it affects migration, broadly speaking, and displacing people from their homes, from their regions, forcing them to migrate, to remain internally displaced persons. And we're going to have two guests, including myself, who will be joining us, who will be talking about their own areas of expertise. My name is Todd Scribner. I'm from the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, and I work in the Migration and Refugee Services Office. I work in the policy division here. We have Dan DeLeo, is an assistant professor and director of the Justice, Peace, and Studies program at Creighton University. His teaching and research focus on Catholic social teaching and climate change. Since 2009, Dr. DeLeo has been a consultant with the Catholic Climate Covenant, of which the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops is a founding member. We also have Dennis Kellogg, who has worked since January of 2015 with the Carmelite NGO as their chief administrative officer. He's also an economic policy specialist at the Jesuit Social Research Institute and has taught sociology for over 35 years, most recently at Loyola University of New Orleans. So I'm going to hand this over right now to Dan, and he's going to be able to give an opportunity to talk about climate change. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Todd. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm grateful to all of you who are spending your afternoon with us learning about this topic, which is a topic that touches every facet of life, every aspect of Catholic social teaching, and we'll talk specifically about how that implicates migration. In order to do that, there are a lot of different ways that we can begin the conversation, but I want to begin with the science. And I really want to spend some time with the science because I think that more than anything is what makes this issue so unique. And I think we tend to have kind of a general understanding of the science, but I want to make sure that folks have a solid foundation, but also really understand the implications. So when we talk about climate change, we're talking about the greenhouse effect. So this natural process where the sun emits shortwave solar radiation, it passes through the natural atmosphere of greenhouse gases. The planet absorbs those shortwave radiations and it warms the planet. Once that warming has occurred, the planet re-emits some of that radiation, but it does so after having converted the shortwave radiation to long-wave radiation. That's significant because long-wave radiation doesn't pass easily through the natural atmosphere of greenhouse gases. Those gases, carbon, methane, nitrous oxide, they absorb that long-wave radiation and they re-emit it in lots of different directions, some of which goes back towards the planet for a second round of warming. That's a good thing, at least from our perspective. The planet would be about 60 degrees colder if we didn't have the natural atmosphere of greenhouse gases. The problem is that since the Industrial Revolution, we have significantly thickened the blanket of atmospheric greenhouse gases that surround the planet. So you can see here atmospheric concentrations of carbon dioxide going back 400,000 years. You can actually double this and go back 800,000. And so you can see there are natural variations that are due to slight changes in the Earth's orbit, the axial tilt of the planet. But we've generally never gone above 300 parts per million until the onset of the Industrial Revolution, where we began to burn fossil fuels that pollute carbon and other greenhouse gases. And so as you can see here, cyclically, at a time when you would expect atmospheric carbon to be going down, we have skyrocketed up to a level we've never seen. Just like if you're laying in bed and you start to put more blankets on, you would expect the planet to begin to get hotter. And that's exactly what we've seen. Average global temperature has gone up more than a full degrees Celsius since 1880. And as hopefully folks are well aware and well versed, 97% or more of actively publishing climate scientists agree these warming trends are extremely likely due to human activities. So you can't account for the warming that we've seen without considering human activities. And so this is the science, just the very foundations, and you've got some resources here to follow up. And as Todd said, there are lots of effects, lots of consequences, and some of which are geophysical. And so this is just a screenshot from NASA's website, and I won't go through this in detail because hopefully it's well-worn information. But as the planet's gotten warmer, we've seen shrinking ice sheets, glacial retreat, sea level rise, ocean acidification as the ocean absorbs some of that carbon. And so we have all of these geophysical effects. But as Pope Francis emphasizes throughout Laudato Si, we humans are creatures. We are part of the natural world. Whatever happens to the natural world to some degree impacts human persons and communities. And so we can talk about the geophysical effects of climate change. There are humanitarian effects that are inexorably tied to what happens to the quote unquote natural world. So as many of you I'm sure are aware, as we've seen global warming, we've seen increased incidence of drought and food stresses, especially in vulnerable places around the world. We've seen increased events and incidents of wildfires. This is an image from California wildfires 2 summers ago. So this impacts human communities. As those sea levels rise and as food and water become more scarce, this, as is our topic for today, produce forced migration. And so as the study from Cornell University suggests, rising seas alone could result in 2 billion refugees by 2100. I'll show you some images of kind of what that might look like or what would catalyze that here in a moment. But so rising sea levels alone catalyze this forced displacement. And this is happening around the world, but this is also happening right here in the United States. So this is a story that ran a couple of years ago about some of the United States' first climate refugees, a community down in Louisiana near Dennis that's had to move inland as the sea level has increasingly risen. So we can look at this in terms of maybe some of the obvious effects in terms of the physical and the humanitarian, but there are also maybe some more not so obvious ways that this can lead to forced migration. So this is a report from the US Department of Defense that recognizes climate change as a threat multiplier and as a violence exacerbator. And that might maybe seem a little bit abstract when you first hear that, but when you think about what the causes of violence are, oftentimes it's dispute over increasingly scarce resources. Violence occurs when people enter into existing communities, sometimes that don't want them or aren't willing to receive them. And so the effects of climate change are, again, this interconnected web of effects and impacts. And so this is the assessment from the US DoD, but this has also been documented, for example, in this paper from the National Academy of Sciences, talking about how the Syrian civil war was likely exacerbated by climate change. Drought in rural agrarian communities in Syria forced populations to move into the cities, which weren't equipped to handle increasing flows of migrants. And people got upset as their needs weren't met, and they had to fight over increasingly scarce resources. And so climate change and the associated drought has been a catalyst for civil war. So connections in ways that we might not always recognize, but in ways that are significant for the real lives of persons and communities. For me, this is really what drew me to this issue when I was an undergraduate, actually studying sociology, in thinking about the effects of climate change and their unequal distribution. And the fact is that the people who are most responsible for causing the issue are least vulnerable to its implications and its effects. And so this, as you can see, is the world skewed according to poverty. So this is countries living on less than $1.25 a day, or populations living on less than $1.25 a day. And so you can see the wealthiest places in the world are contracted, the poorest places are expanded. And yet if we look at who's historically responsible for carbon dioxide, the map is flipped. So you can see the wealthiest places in the world are most responsible for carbon between 1850 and 2011. And you can see the poorest places in the world are relatively least responsible for causing climate change. So this is a justice issue, and this is something that, for example, the German bishops have described when they emphasize that this great inequality between polluters and victims makes anthropogenic climate change into a fundamental problem of global justice. So this is a justice issue in so many ways. When we think about climate change and where this is headed, it's important to understand a couple of concepts, one of which is climate feedbacks. And climate feedbacks, as you can see here from NASA's website, are processes that increase an initial warming. So warming causes additional warming. So for example, this is a glacier or an ice sheet off the northern coast of Siberia. This picture was taken in the summer of 2013. This is the same ice sheet in the summer of 2018, so 5 years later. So you can see the glacial retreat. And that's significant because ice is reflective. It has a high albedo. That's why you wear light colored clothes in the summer. And as this ice has melted, it exposes darker soil that absorbs more of that heat that's being redirected, or initially coming in from the sun and then redirected through the greenhouse effect. And so the planet begins to get hotter as this ice is melting. Warming causes warming. So there are lots of these different feedbacks. This is just one example. So this is a process that is not stable. It has a tendency to exacerbate it, to accelerate. Associated with feedback loops is the concept of tipping points. And tipping points, as you can see from the Nobel Prize-winning Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tipping points refer to thresholds in a system that, when exceeded, are essentially irreversible. So there are points beyond which warming is irreversible and will, in fact, begin to catalyze even more warming. General scientific consensus is that the tipping point beyond which we ought not to go is 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. 2 degrees is okay. 1.5 degrees significantly mitigates the risk. And so 1.5 is the goal. We've already risen more than a full degree. And so, as you can see here from the IPCC, in order to stabilize at 1.5 degrees, we would need to cut carbon emissions 45%, so roughly half, by 2030 from 2010 levels. So we basically have 9 years to cut global carbon in half, and it has to reach net zero by 2050. So we basically have 30 years to go carbon neutral as a global economy. We are headed in the opposite direction fast. So we are nowhere near bending the curve towards what the IPCC is calling for. You're hopefully aware that the current administration has re-entered the US into the Paris Agreement. Unfortunately, the Paris Agreement's initial commitments from countries are nowhere near what's needed. So as you can see here, the United Nations projects that if we rely only on the Paris Agreement, we'll still see more than 3 degrees of warming this century. So there's a significant gap, as you can see here, between the dotted line shows what countries have committed to, and the steep line shows what we actually need to get to by 2030 in order to avoid this tipping point. So, and 3 degrees might not sound like a lot. When we think about climate futures, I think this is a matter, as my colleague at Creighton here, Rich Miller, talks about, it's a matter of procedural justice. People have a right to know about the future that they're being exposed to. And so as you can see here from the IPCC, there are a variety of different models that would move us towards different levels of warming by the end of the century. So in theory, we could stabilize below 2 degrees. We could also go 3, 4, and 5 degrees. That's a different world. 3, 4, 5 degrees doesn't look like our current planet. That's 6, 8, 10, 15, 20 feet of sea level rise. Just to give you a visual of what that might look like, this is a model projection of South Florida and the Keys under 10 feet of sea level rise. And this isn't Superstorm Sandy where the water comes up, but then it subsides. This is underwater. This is submersion. So you can see Florida, you can see Fort Lauderdale, you can see Miami, you can see the Keys. This is 10 feet of sea level. 20 feet looks even worse, obviously. So these are, again, projections. So we get into 4 and 5 degrees of warming. This are Miami, San Francisco, Boston, Venice, under 20 feet of sea level. Again, when you think about that Cornell study, that rising sea levels alone might displace 2 billion people by 2100. This is what it looks like. Again, this is a different world from what we currently know. This is also a life issue, and arguably this is an existential threat to human life. And again, I'm quoting my colleague here at Creighton, Rich Miller. He in this paper is citing 2 preeminent climate scientists, Kevin Anderson at the Tyndall Center, and then Hans Schellenhuber, who's a member of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences. Together, they've suggested that at between 4 and 6 degrees of warming, the carrying capacity of the planet could be reduced to between 500 million and 1 billion people. Again, that is possible, very possible by 2100 based on the decisions that we make. As a point of reference, the current world population is 7.7 billion, so a carrying capacity of 1 billion would be the death of 6.7 billion with a B people, 87% of the current global population. So this is obviously a projection. There are obviously different variables in here, but the scope of this is unimaginable. And so, for example, as Bishop McElroy has noted, the death toll from abortion is more immediate, but the long-term death toll from unchecked climate change is larger and threatens the very future of humanity. So when we think about life issues and we think about issues in different ways. For example, Bishop Stowe has suggested it could be argued that creation is the preeminent issue because without the environment to sustain human life, you can't have human life. So again, I think it's a matter of procedural justice. Let people know what this might look like in the future. People have a right to know what they're being exposed to. And so in terms of responses, the Catholic tradition recognizes this as a preeminent moral issue. So in Laudato Si, Francis echoes the teachings of Benedict and John Paul. Climate change is a global problem with grave implications and represents a principal challenge facing humanity. And so when we think about responses, the Catholic tradition has always emphasized both charitable works and social justice, the 2 feet of love and action, this resource from USCCB. So charitable works, interpersonal, local, and then social justice, work to reform systems, structures, and policies. So Francis talks about both in Laudato Si. So for example, in terms of charitable works, he talks about avoiding paper and plastic, using public transportation, turning off the lights. As I say to my students, though, we are not going to individually bike our way out of climate change. This is by definition going to require social justice in terms of structures. So for example, Francis in Laudato Si emphasizes the need to develop policies so that in the next few years, the emission of carbon and polluting gases can be drastically reduced, substituting fossil fuels and developing renewable energy. Most recently, the Vatican has also endorsed the strategy of fossil fuel divestment. So here you can see the dicasteries, the Interdicasteral Working Group has suggested or emphasized promoting responsible investments in social and environmental sectors by evaluating progressive disinvestment from the fossil fuel sector, so changing the system structures that exacerbate this issue. And there are lots of opportunities, one of which I'll just put here in collaboration between Creighton University and Catholic Climate Covenant. We're holding a biennial conference series. So we did one last summer. We've got our second gathering this summer, and then we'll do another in 2023. And the idea here is to bring together 8 different working groups, and you can see them listed in blue down at the bottom, to think about and discern how to integrate Laudato Si into the different ministries and tracks of the U.S. Catholic Church. So if you're interested in possibly joining one of these working groups, you can see the link here under the slide heading, and you can apply to be in one of the working groups. And we're excited about all the people that we've already got. We've begun some of the discernment planning processes. So Todd, I'm sure you'll send out these slides, but if folks have questions, you can just visit CatholicClimateCovenant.org and click on the conference page there. So hopefully this gives some information. I know it's not the most hopeful way to spend an afternoon, but as I said, I think it's a matter of procedural justice for folks to understand and really have a good sense of the science, of what we're looking at, and then to frame that in terms of our Catholic faith and the responses suggested by Catholic social teaching. So Todd, I will turn things over to you, and I'm grateful for the opportunity again to share this with everyone.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Dan. I really appreciate it. You have a way of making something very complex sound very manageable intellectually. So it's really helpful that we have someone like you on here. Before I sort of launch into my own little spiel, I want to just invite everyone who has a question you can share it in the Q&A or the chat box, I believe. I'm not sure if we're going to be able to bring people on to speak in person. Sarah, my colleague, when we get to that point, may know better than I do if you can actually ask it verbally or not. But in the meantime, if you have a question, feel free to ask it in the Q&A. So I really appreciate that. So I want to start this section. I started my last little talk with a quote. I want to start this one with two quotes, and I'll explain why I do that in just a minute. The first quote is from Benedict XVI from his 2010 World Day of Peace message, which actually integrated quite a bit from, I believe it was the 1990 World Day of Peace message from St. John Paul II. But in the World Day of Peace in 2010, Benedict XVI said, "Can we disregard the growing phenomenon of environmental refugees, people who are forced by the degradation of their natural habitat to forsake it, and often their possessions as well, in order to face the dangers and uncertainties of forced displacement?" The second quote is from Pope Francis in Laudato Si, where he laments, quote, "the tragic rise in the number of migrants seeking to flee from the growing poverty caused by environmental degradation. They are not recognized by international conventions as refugees. They bear the loss of the lives they have left behind without enjoying any legal protection whatsoever." So I want to comment on why I chose those two passages. I mean, the first is simply a situation in which the debate over climate change and its effects politically, economically, and elsewhere, in an American context has become very partisan. It's sort of divides along political lines. You're with it or you're against it, depending on what party you're for. A generalization, I admit, but there's oftentimes a real political divide that breaks into this discussion. And oftentimes, when you look at Pope Francis and Pope Benedict XVI, they're often contrasted as sort of a conservative pope and a liberal pope. Francis being a more liberal pope, Benedict XVI maybe being a more conservative pope. And those of that specific persuasion is usually drawn to one or the other. Again, an overgeneralization, but I think there's something to that. But really what these quotes represent is that there's actually more continuity between pontificates that's not recognized. We have a situation where both Pope Benedict XVI and Pope Francis recognize the significance of climate change, environmental degradation as a mechanism that's going to affect us personally. Again, goes back all the way back to Paul VI too. But these are just two recent examples. So I just want to point out the continuity. The other element is that these highlight the important role that the poor and the marginalized play in the teachings of the church on this issue. Dan pointed to this earlier on, but it's really they're the ones that are going to get whacked the hardest. It's not, at least early on, initially. It's not the first world. It's not me necessarily, but it's people who live in developing nations, people who are economically in a very difficult situation, financially and otherwise. They're going to be impacted first. And so, we need to keep them in mind. How do we mitigate the circumstances so that they are not impacted as negatively as they often will be if nothing is done to reduce the causes of climate change? So I want to now talk a little bit at the difference between kind of immediate impact displacement, if you will, and slow onset displacement, very briefly. And I'm going to share my screen here. So here's some quick numbers to just to kind of throw out here. By 2050, there'll be somewhere upwards of 200 million people displaced, at the very least, by environmental causes. 2 million of these people will be from Central America or Mexico. These might be conservative numbers that I'm using. There's been 24.5 million people displaced because of environmental disasters each year from 2008 on average to the present. And there are 24.9 million or thereabouts displaced in 2019. The Internal Displacement Monitoring Center is actually one organization that helps to track sort of displacement because of natural disasters. It's kind of it's an interesting website, and it's worth looking at if you're interested in it. And here you can see in this map, basically the blue represents displacements that are a consequence of natural disasters, and the orange a consequence of sort of violence, war, that sort of thing. And so if you look at a place like the Philippines, for example, you can see that there are about 4 and change million people or displacement situations. This is not a per person, it's not 4 million people, but it's 4 million examples of displacement that occurred as a consequence of a natural disaster. Most of these people are internally displaced rather than fleeing across the border. And a lot of times this internal displacement might be temporary in nature. So it's not as though it's a permanent phenomenon. They may be displaced by a storm and then they're able to return to the, to their home maybe, or maybe not, or at least to the local region that they came from. And it tracks the kinds of displacement. So, I mean, for example, in 2019, in November, over 1 million people were displaced by typhoon in the Philippines alone, and it affected other countries as well. But I mean, this website, if you're interested in exploring a little bit more about the kind of the sudden onset situations, a typhoon, a wildfire, a massive storm of some sort or another, maybe an earthquake. It could be that obviously wouldn't be climate related, but it would be naturally related. It impacts immediately and drives people off their home. There are also situations of slow onset displacement. And that would be a situation where, temperatures rise over a number of years and it makes the living situation that was perhaps conducible to, farming, agriculture of some sort, no longer viable because the temperature rises and droughts and other forms of environmental situations emerge, and they get very difficult to actually function in that way. Could also be the rising sea levels that may happen over years and years and years that inundate low-lying coastal regions, cities. Dan talks about Miami, I believe it was, and so that takes over time. These are situations that we need to get a hold of now so as to ensure that they're not prevalent moving forward. So that's just one thing you can look at. The other issue is that there are a lot of other kind of secondary sort of factors that play into the engagement between climate change, environment degradation, and migration. Dan mentioned the situations surrounding war and the way in which environmental situations can help to increase vulnerabilities, conflicts on a local level that can then expand into, other situations like the situation in Syria. That's one area that's worth remembering. Another area that it's kind of maybe seem kind of marginal to us, but for those who are interested in migration and migration policy and the longer impacts of migration, there's another connection that I think is worth just briefly discussing. That's the connection between climate change and disease. Environmental degradation does not only play a driving role in migration, as you might occur if there's a major storm, but it also can play a downstream role as well in terms of migrant populations that are received. One of the dangers that we're facing, I think, as we move forward more and more, is the extent to which deforestation, the destruction of natural habitats, human expansion can actually create the conditions so that new diseases actually emerge within populations. I mean, we've seen it already. HIV, SARS, bird flu, and COVID most recently are situations where there's been a disease that's moved from the animal to the human world, and has had significant consequences. I mean, just look over the past year. For HIV, we're talking about millions, tens of millions of lives lost. There was a quote that I saw from a leader at the USAID, who I forget who it was specifically, but he said that nearly 75% of all new emerging or re-emerging diseases affecting humans at the beginning of the 21st century are zoonotic, which means they're from animals. So what does this have to do with migration? Well, these situations could potentially drive migration situations, I guess. If there's a local that's hit by a pandemic, a local area hit by a pandemic, and people flee from that region in order to escape the pandemic. But it also reinforces longstanding concerns that migrants are carriers of disease. It's a long established nativist kind of trope that immigrants carry diseases. We need to keep immigrants out in order to keep the body politic, the local communities safe from an infestation of disease. And you saw this at the end of the 19th century when it came to sort of doing vetting processes of people coming to Ellis Island and across the US-Mexico border, where there was an expansion really of focus on the intersection between disease and migration, and using disease as a reason to keep migrants out of the country, to disqualifying them from entering. I mean, it became a significant issue in the early decades of the 20th century. This was amplified really by along racial and class prejudices that kind of predisposed certain populations to be more harshly checked in terms of medical interventions and more closely looked at as a consequence. We've seen this recently, just this past year, and this is one of the reasons why I thought about it with COVID. Maybe there's some good reasons for in the early response to kind of be concerned about trying to get a hold of the things, but it was really been a pandemic that has closed borders for extended periods of time, that has sort of led to a situation in which people are very much kind of internal looking and inward looking. And it's complicated, obviously. I mean, we're trying to get control of a pandemic, but it reinforces these sort of perspectives that migrants are disease carriers. And that can have consequences in the way in which we approach our view of migrants and immigrants and refugees long after any specific pandemic is passed. So I'm more worried about looking forward. How does this framing now affect the framing down the road? I want to close before I just turn it over to Dennis, who's going to start looking briefly, so look at some of the domestic situation and his work with the NGO, is the idea of language and terminology. So we have a situation where it's like, what do we call them? What do we call people who are displaced as a consequence of environmental degradation or climate change? Are they climate refugees? Are they environmental migrants? There's oftentimes people want to refer to them as refugees, and in a way that it makes sense to do so. On legal lines, it becomes more difficult to do so because the Refugee Convention, as you all know, is the sort of the defining document that is very precise in who qualifies as a refugee. And people who are displaced as a result of climate change are not qualified under that convention. It is one of the dangers if we try to look at, there's a couple dangers to looking or declaring these populations as refugees as such. The first is that there's tens of millions and it could overwhelm the system even more. We don't, the international community does not resettle refugees like it needs to, in the numbers that it needs to in order to be effective in response to the problem. Adding millions of more as individuals as refugees might complicate things even further. Most displacement that is a result of climate change, a lot of it, most perhaps, is internal. So that people remain internally displaced. They don't necessarily, cross borders. In order to be a refugee, you need to cross a border. So it wouldn't necessarily protect a lot of the people who need protections now because of the displacement that occurred as a consequence of environmental degradation. And it would also, any changes to identifying these populations as refugees would require kind of a renegotiation of the convention in order to include them in. Reopening the convention could pose a lot of political problems that may actually reduce the protections that are there now and the obligations that states have under the current convention. So there are problems. So what to do? Obviously we don't say, oh, well, you're not a refugee, therefore you don't deserve protection. In fact, what is important is that we need to provide kind of some sort of new humanitarian visas that specifically look at sort of migrants who are dislocated because of environmental degradation and climate change. There would be a parallel structure perhaps to the refugee resettlement program, but a different one that includes X number of visas per year, per country potentially. And we should also take advantage of pre-existing protections, sort of like temporary protected status, which could function as a mechanism through which we could provide protections for people who are here from countries that have experienced, significant environmental problems. We do that now. There might be a need to expand it as these kinds of situations worsen and sort of expand. On that, I'll stop. I'm going to hand it over to Dennis. I looked at sort of the international stuff. Dennis is going to kind of, I think, look at more of the domestic side and some of the stuff he's doing, and then we can take some questions after that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks very much, Todd. And thanks to everyone joining us for this webinar. First, some quick background on the Carmelite NGO, the organization with which I work. This non-governmental organization is an instrument of the global Carmelite family and is designed to further the cause of social and ecological justice. We are accredited or have observer status to a number of United Nations bodies, including the Economic and Social Council, the UN Environment Program, and the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. These relationships allow us to be a part of the global dialogue on matters important to us, such as global sustainable development and the climate crisis. For more information about all of our work, including the work on climate, you can go to our website, carmelitengo.org. I'll put it in the chat at some point. Our website is available in English and Spanish, and you can see our projects and publications there. Among our projects is a secondary school curriculum that we created that teaches Laudato Si, the papal encyclical on sustainable development and the environment. It teaches Laudato Si across disciplines. We also have an adult study guide for the encyclical. We have also produced a great short video on the impact of sea level rise on coastal communities, particularly here in Louisiana. You can find that and all this other stuff on our website. The video is also available on YouTube. You can simply search The Rising Seas Carmelite NGO, and this great 15-minute video will pop up for you. Now, globally, it has been estimated that perhaps 200 million people will be displaced by climate change within just the next 30 years. Far more potentially, as Dan very clearly stated, could be far, far more. But 200 million within the next 30 years. Sea level rise, stronger storms, excessive heat, drought, water shortages. These things are problems in and of themselves, of course. But on top of that, all of these things have ripple effects that further exacerbate human displacement and suffering. Violent conflict, for example, will increase due to the desperate times that are to come, as has been mentioned also. There'll be wars not about oil, but maybe about water and access to water. Migrants leaving vulnerable areas may not be welcome to where they are heading, and there'll be clashes there. So increased violence seems to be part of what we will be looking at in the coming decades, due to a significant degree to climate change. The specific problems, ecological and social, that people will and are already facing differ by location, by region, and the ability to adapt and survive will depend on the resources available to people. And for many, sadly, they will not have the necessary resources to effectively deal with the unfolding crisis. The years-long humanitarian crisis at our own US southern border has a climate change dimension. There are many factors, of course, to what's happening, but climate change is part of the equation. Guatemala and other Central American nations have had devastating storms and disruptions in agricultural production. And these things have been linked to climate change. And this has encouraged the movement of people away from these devastated or vulnerable areas. And they go in search of not just a better life. They're coming here not just for a quote unquote better life, but very often it is survival. We need to meet this moment with compassion and love rather than resentment and fear. We certainly need to understand the social and ecological roots of these problems that are forcing people to leave their homes. Climate change has an impact, as we're already talking about, learning about today in this webinar, direct or indirect impact on so many aspects of human existence here and around the world. Aside from international movement of people escaping the effects of climate change, there are internal displacements as well, as speakers have already begun to talk about. In the US, some native Alaskan communities, as well as communities here in Louisiana, have been identified as among the first climate change refugees, quote unquote. And thanks to Todd for addressing that issue. There are all sorts of problems calling internally displaced people, our fellow Americans, refugees. They're typically insulted by that designation. So it's important to be aware of the terminology. So these first climate change migrants, in the case of the Arctic, the native populations, melting, the Arctic melting due to global warming is causing flooding in certain coastal communities. And so people are having to relocate. And here in Louisiana, I'll talk about a couple of things here. Everybody remembers Hurricane Katrina, well over 15 years ago. It devastated the northern Gulf Coast, and right here in the wonderful city of New Orleans, 80% was underwater. The population of this city has not returned to pre-Katrina levels. The current population is still down around 15% from where it was prior to Katrina. And just this year, 3 hurricanes and 2 tropical storms battered Louisiana and forced people from their homes. Lake Charles, which is in the southwest corner of the state, was particularly hard hit, getting 2 hurricanes, including Laura, one of the most powerful to ever make landfall in the United States. And these stronger, more powerful, more devastating hurricanes are linked to global warming, the warming of the oceans that fuel these storms. Many people who fled the storms last year here in Louisiana have not been able to return home yet. Meanwhile, the north shore of Lake Pontchartrain, see New Orleans is surrounded by water. And to our north is Lake Pontchartrain. The north shore, as we call it, that's the communities on the north of Lake Pontchartrain. Collectively, they've seen pretty dramatic growth over the years in their population. Baton Rouge, our state capital, northwest of New Orleans, has also seen fairly significant growth in the population. Meanwhile, the very southern people who are in these southern areas, the population is shrinking already. A lot of people have left New Orleans or left recently, Lake Charles and so forth. They've left and they're unable to come back for a number of reasons. Their homes are gone. Maybe they can't afford to rebuild or can't afford flood insurance and so forth. And so they can't go back home. And then others anticipate the devastation yet to come and are beginning to move to more inland areas. I mean, there are lots of reasons why people are moving to the North Shore and to other places, but clearly a climate change and its impact is part of that story. A particular case study I wanted to share with you, Isle de Jean Charles. This is an island along coastal Louisiana. It was settled in the 1800s by Native Americans. They were looking for refuge, right? They were escaping persecution, and they found their home on this island. And they made their home there since the 1800s. The island was once over 22,000 acres. It has since lost more than 98% of its land mass and is now just 320 acres. This place that once was home to hundreds of families is down to a handful. Several years ago, a plan was developed to move all of the remaining families, along with a few others that had already left, move them collectively to a new home. The residents of this island have termed their new destination, their new home, the New Isle. And it's been a long process of resettlement. It's been slow and difficult. It's getting close to completion. It's not quite there yet. And there are a few people still on the island of Jean Charles, and they tell us that they're not going to leave. They're going to stay. It is their home. They live there for generations. These folks in Alaska and here in Louisiana are, as I said, among the US's first climate change migrants. They will certainly not be the last. And I want you to just think about our little island that I'm describing here in Louisiana. Small, just a few families, and this project of moving them to a new home. It's been years of planning, millions of dollars. There's been federal grant money available to them. And think about how painful it has been for people to leave their beloved community. And now multiply that number of people, right, and the cost, the financial cost of movement, and the hardship and pain, multiply that many times over. See, one small island or a few communities in Alaska, these are just the tip of the iceberg, as it were. This is just the beginning. Think about what is going to happen down the road nationally and globally. And of course, as has been pointed out, those without resources will suffer the worst fate. We need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, Francis reminds us. We should put that sentence on the bathroom mirror in the morning, so it's the first thing we see when we wake up. It reminds us of something that we should carry with us as we do our work. We need to hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. But even people and communities with money will have to spend a fortune to relocate or to construct higher levees or stronger flood walls. No one will be immune, but the poor will indeed suffer the most, and they are already suffering the most. They don't have the resources to adapt and to move and so forth. We must take action. Things that can be done are at the individual level, organizational and community level, national and global levels. From our faith perspective, the Pontifical Academy of Sciences, Pope Francis, and previous popes have all tried to wake us up. The problem of climate change is real and it is urgent, they have said. Creation is under assault and we are being called to act. Certainly we can take steps to limit our carbon footprint and increase our use of green energy. I suggest people look into Catholic Energies, great organization that helps Catholic campuses, schools, medical facilities, dioceses, parishes become more energy efficient, as well as shift to solar. Through their financing methods, organizations can save money while saving creation. So action needs to be taken to address climate change for many reasons. What we have been talking about today in this webinar is its impact specifically on migration, the movement of people within and between nations. It has only begun. It will only intensify in the years ahead. Let's act together and let's act now. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Dennis. A powerful presentation, and I think some keen insights as to what we really need to do in order to respond effectively in our own place, in our own situation that we find ourselves. It's really helpful. If you all have any questions, I would suggest or welcome them in the Q&A. We do have one. I'm gonna give it to Dan, since I'm just a migration guy. That's what I do. And so the question is, if climate change is an existential threat to humanity, why does the USCCB still consider abortion the preeminent issue of the day? I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of the relationships between these various deep moral questions.
I do. I think that language of preeminence has been widely recognized as problematic by bishops foremost. It was the language that was included in the most recent document, Forming Consciences for Faithful Citizenship, or in the introductory note. And there was significant group of bishops who voted against that language and the inclusion of that designation. And I am not a bishop. I do not work at the Bishops' Conference, so I can't speak to necessarily why that is, but I would initially respond that this is, as I said, a life issue. And as Bishop Stowe suggested, this is potentially the issue that underpins all other issues. And I think it's important to also recognize that a lot of times we get focused on issues. But in Catholic moral theology, the primary concern is actually values, abstract concepts and ideals to which we commit ourselves. The Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church identifies 4 cornerstone values: justice, love. These are the abstract things to which we commit ourselves. And values show up in issues, but values transcend issues, and no one issue has a monopoly on a value. So when we start talking about life as the operative value, certain issues may be more or less associated with that value, but no issue has a monopoly on it. And I think we have to recognize, again, the interconnectedness of values, issues, and circumstances, in the sense that they may be connected in ways that we don't always appreciate. So I'm not sure if that directly answers the question, but I think it requires a potentially a significant reframing of what we're really committing ourselves to in terms of a people of faith working to advance God's kingdom, ourselves values first and foremost.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate the answer. Does anyone else have any questions? Please feel free to type them into the Q&A box. While you're thinking of questions, this webinar will be posted on the justiceforimmigrants.org website. So if you have other people who couldn't make it, but you think would be interested in watching it, or if you want to include it in your newsletter, whatever, just to get it out, we'd be more than welcome for you to do so. Please spread it around. Next month in April, I believe it's the week, it's around this time as well in April. I don't think the date has been nailed down, but we're really going to turn our attention to the next webinar looking at immigration reform and some of the immigration reform legislation that has kind of surfaced over the past several months, a couple months, with the arrival of the Biden administration. So keep an eye out for that. It's going to provide I think some really good insights into like what's happening and what are some of the obstacles and complications in moving it forward, and really what does it contain. What are the things that we're focused on, what do the bishops want to see in it, which I think are in alignment with really a lot of what you all it's presumptuous of me to say that, but what a lot of Catholics out there are in favor of. And we'd love to get your feedback both on this and on future webinars, things you would like to see, things you don't like. If you have any ideas for webinars, we welcome them. So please feel free to reach out to me whenever you would like. And I thank you. It doesn't look like there's actually any questions. So we were obviously incredibly comprehensive, as I would expect Dennis and Dan. I'm sure I left huge gaps in my presentation, but next time. I really appreciate it. So I guess we'll close it out then. Feel free to reach out to any of us at any time when we send out the information on this webinar to provide a link. We'll also ask you look at both the Carmelite NGO, their website, and also look at Creighton upcoming conference. Have a good time with both. So thank you very much, and I will talk to you at a later date. Webinar in action. Thank you, Sister Maria. I appreciate it. I see your webinar in actions. Well, let's chat, okay? If we can at another time. Okay, that's that. Have
Thank
a good
you.
one, y'all. Appreciate it.
Take care.